The biting wind howled its ancient song through the frosted pines, a prelude to the relentless winter that gripped the remote American frontier in the 1860s. Inside his small, isolated cabin, Dr. Elias Thorne meticulously cleaned a surgical scalpel, its polished steel reflecting the dancing flames of the hearth. He was a man of quiet competence, his hands accustomed to precision, yet his eyes held a profound weariness, a shadow born of a past he desperately sought to outrun. Once a revered surgeon in the bustling city, he had fled, leaving behind the whispers of scandal and the indelible stain of a child lost to infection, a tiny life extinguished despite his most fervent efforts. Here, amidst the snow-capped mountains, he sought not fame or fortune, but a quiet absolution, a redemption found in anonymous service, far from the judging eyes of a world that remembered his failure more vividly than his triumphs. His cabin, though sparse, was a testament to his former life. A worn wooden case held a collection of specialized surgical instruments, each glinting with a silent story of countless operations, of lives saved and, occasionally, lost. The air was thick with the scent of pine and old leather, a comforting blend that spoke of solitude and self-imposed exile. A sense of melancholic peace pervaded the space, a fragile sanctuary against the harsh realities of the wilderness and the even harsher ghosts of his memory. The bitter cold outside was a constant, palpable presence, seeping through the chinks in the logs, mirrored by the chill that often settled in his heart. As the afternoon waned, the wind's song grew more insistent, a mournful dirge accompanied by the first tentative flakes of a burgeoning blizzard. Thorne glanced out the small, grimy window, observing the sky's deepening bruise of purple and gray. He knew these mountains, knew their temper. This was no ordinary snowfall. This was a storm that promised to bury the world in white, cutting off all paths, all connections to the distant settlements. He began to prepare for a long, solitary night, stacking more firewood, checking the oil in his lamp. For a fleeting moment, an image flashed through his mind. The gaslit streets of the city, the hushed corridors of a grand hospital, and the sterile, unforgiving white sheets that covered the small, still form of a child. He shook his head, pushing the memory back into the shadows from which it always threatened to emerge. Suddenly, a violent pounding rattled the cabin door, a desperate, frantic rhythm that shattered the quiet solitude. Thorne froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy iron poker by the hearth. Who could possibly be out in such weather? The knocking intensified, laced with a guttural cry of pain. Cautiously, he unbarred the door. A figure stumbled inward, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards with a gasp that was more air than sound. The man was large, rugged, his face streaked with grime and blood, his heavy fur coat already dusted with snow. A dark, rapidly expanding stain blossomed on his side, soaking through layers of fabric. As Thorne knelt, assessing the wound, his gaze fell upon the man's face, illuminated by the flickering firelight. A shock coursed through him, a jolt of recognition mixed with a chilling dread. It was Silas. The name was infamous throughout the territory, whispered in fear and awe, a notorious outlaw, a man whose reputation preceded him like a dark storm cloud. Thorne's hands, trained to heal, hesitated for the barest fraction of a second above the bleeding man. Here, bleeding and broken at his feet, was a criminal, a threat, perhaps even a murderer. Yet, he was also a human life, teetering on the precipice of death. An immediate, agonizing moral dilemma crashed over him. Could he, a man who sought redemption through saving lives, simply let this notorious outlaw die? Or would treating him, a known criminal, risk his own principles, perhaps even his own fragile peace, and the very redemption he so desperately craved? The storm outside raged, mirroring the tempest brewing within his soul. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The outlaw Silas lay sprawled on Thorne's cabin floor, his breath ragged, each exhalation a shallow gasp against the encroaching cold. Thorne's practiced eyes immediately assessed the grim reality. A deep abdominal injury, likely from a bullet or a knife, had torn through flesh and muscle, threatening vital organs. Without immediate intervention, without surgery, Silas would surely perish. But even with Thorne's considerable skill, the wound was a gaping maw, a prime target for the insidious, invisible enemy Thorne knew all too well. Infection. The memory of the lost child, his small, feverish body succumbing to the very thing Thorne now fought to prevent, clawed at the edges of his consciousness. Outside, the blizzard had escalated into a full-blown fury. The windows rattled violently, thin sheets of ice forming intricate patterns on the glass, obscuring any view of the world beyond. The wind shrieked like a banshee, a relentless, mournful cry that swallowed all other sounds. Thorne knew, with a sinking certainty, that no help would reach them. The mountain passes would be choked with snow, the roads impassable. They were entirely alone, isolated by a white, swirling wall of winter's wrath. His specialized surgical tools gleaming in their wooden case lay ready, a testament to his urban past, yet they were useless without the means to sterilize them properly. No autoclave, no boiling water bath, nothing but the raw, untamed elements of the frontier. Thorne knelt beside Silas, his internal conflict a raging storm mirroring the one outside. His oath as a doctor, a sacred vow to preserve life, clashed violently with the identity of the man before him. Silas, the notorious outlaw, a man whose hands were undoubtedly stained with the blood of others. Was he worthy of salvation? Was Thorne, haunted by his own medical failure, truly obligated to save a life that had perhaps taken many? The ethical tightrope stretched taut beneath him, threatening to snap with every beat of his heart. The ghost of the child, lost to infection, whispered accusations in his mind, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the immense responsibility he carried. To save Silas, knowing his past, felt like a betrayal of the innocent. To let him die felt like a betrayal of his very essence as a healer. Just as despair threatened to consume him, Silas stirred, his eyes fluttering open to meet Thorne's. A guttural whisper escaped his parched lips, barely audible above the howling wind. Eliza. The single word struck Thorne like a physical blow, shattering his carefully constructed composure. Eliza. His Eliza. His deceased wife. The woman whose memory he cherished, whose passing had driven him to this desolate place. The name spoken by this notorious outlaw was an unexpected, cruel twist of fate, a revelation that complicated everything. Thorne's mind reeled, a torrent of questions flooding his thoughts. How did Silas know Eliza? What was their connection? Was this pain, this inexplicable intimacy of a shared name, another cruel joke from a universe that seemed intent on punishing him? The past, which he had tried so desperately to bury, was now bleeding into his present, intertwining with the fate of a man he had every reason to despise. The blizzard raged, but the true tempest had just begun within Dr. Elias Thorne's fractured heart. The whispered name, Eliza, hung in the frigid air between them, a fragile, invisible bridge connecting two disparate lives yet simultaneously erecting an impenetrable wall of suspicion in Thorne's mind. Eliza. His Eliza. The woman he had loved with an intensity that still ached in his very bones. How could this notorious outlaw, this Silas, even know her name, let alone utter it with such a faint, lingering tenderness? A vivid, unbidden flashback seized Thorne, transporting him back to his youth, to a sun-drenched meadow where a bright-eyed Eliza, then a girl, laughed freely. Beside her, a slightly older boy, all earnest grins and mischievous eyes, had stood, his hand protectively hovering near hers. Silas. It was Silas, a childhood friend of Eliza's, a boy Thorne had always viewed as a harmless, if slightly irritating, rival for her youthful affections. The memory, long buried beneath layers of grief and professional ambition, now resurfaced with a stinging clarity, painting Silas not just as an outlaw, but as a ghost from a past Thorne thought he had outrun. His suspicion intensified, a bitter taste rising in his mouth mingling with a morbid, desperate curiosity. What was the nature of their connection, and why was Silas on his deathbed invoking her name? Thorne's professional instincts, however, were a force honed by years of practice and a deep-seated commitment to life. They began to assert themselves, overriding the tumultuous waves of personal feeling that threatened to drown him. Silas was dying, and Eliza's name, whatever its significance, did not change the immediate dire reality. He needed to act, and he needed to act now. His gaze swept around the small rustic cabin, his mind already shifting gears, transforming from a place of solace into an impromptu operating theater. Every item, every surface was scrutinized for its potential. Sterilization. That was the immediate insurmountable hurdle. Without it, any intervention would be a death sentence, a repeat of his most profound failure. His eyes landed on the sturdy cast-iron pot hanging over the dying embers of the fireplace. A spark ignited in his mind, a glimmer of the ingenuity that had once marked his brilliance in the city's finest hospitals. Then the fire itself, a source of heat, purification. Ash, often used as an abrasive, could it have a role? And the rough homemade lye soap, a common frontier staple, its harshness a crude form of antiseptic. He began to move with a renewed sense of purpose, his movements economical, deliberate. He filled the cast-iron pot with snow, placing it directly onto the embers, watching as the crystalline flakes slowly melted into water, then began to bubble and steam. This, he thought, was his rudimentary autoclave. The cabin, once a sanctuary of quiet reflection, now hummed with a frantic energy. Thorne rummaged through drawers, pulling out a collection of kitchen items, a long, sharp carving knife, a pair of sturdy tongs, several spoons. Each item, he knew, would need to be meticulously cleaned, then subjected to the scalding heat of the boiling water. He visualized the process, step by agonizing step, the frontier ingenuity merging with his deep medical knowledge. He'd boil the instruments, then use the lye soap and hot water to scrub his own hands until they were raw, a desperate attempt to mimic the sterile conditions he had once taken for granted. He would need clean rags, perhaps even some of his own linen to serve as makeshift drapes. A plan, audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its inherent risks, began to coalesce in his mind. It was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice against infection and death, played out in the heart of a blizzard, with a patient who was inextricably linked to his most painful past. The sheer audacity of his improvised scheme, the high probability of failure, and the unknown ramifications of operating on a man who held a secret connection to Eliza weighed heavily on him. Yet, there was no other choice. The storm outside raged, a deafening symphony of wind and snow, but within the cabin, a more profound battle was about to begin, fought with fire, water, and the sheer force of one man's will against the relentless tide of fate. The cabin air grew thick with steam, a humid counterpoint to the biting cold outside, as Thorne raced against time. The blizzard's relentless howl seemed to mock his frantic efforts, yet he pushed on, driven by a desperate resolve. He meticulously cleaned the crude instruments he had chosen from his kitchen, the carving knife, spoons, and tongs, scrubbing them with a fierce intensity, then plunging them into the boiling cast-iron pot. The bubbling water, his makeshift sterilizer, hissed and spat, a tiny victory against the overwhelming forces of nature and infection. His hands, already raw from the lye, soap, and ash he'd used in a crude attempt at antisepsis, moved with a practiced efficiency despite the primitive conditions. Every motion was deliberate, every second precious. He tore strips from an old linen sheet, boiling them too, preparing them as rudimentary bandages and drapes. The scent of wood smoke and damp cloth mingled with the faint, metallic tang of blood from Silas's wound, creating a claustrophobic atmosphere of impending crisis. With the instruments deemed as clean as possible under the circumstances, Thorne turned his attention to Silas. He carefully administered a potent dose of laudanum, watching as the outlaw's ragged breathing deepened, his eyes glazing over, succumbing to the drug's numbing embrace. The rudimentary operating table, fashioned from a sturdy plank laid across two wooden crates, was positioned close to the fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows that lent a macabre drama to the scene. Thorne worked swiftly, his brow furrowed in concentration, his breath misting in the cool air of the cabin. Each incision he made was precise, guided by years of surgical training, yet each movement was fraught with peril. The dim, shifting light made it difficult to discern the full extent of the damage, and the coarse, unyielding fabric of Silas's clothing, now soaked with blood, complicated the delicate task. The operation commenced under the most arduous conditions imaginable. Thorne's hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the immense strain of the moment. He delved into the wound, his fingers probing, searching for the source of the persistent bleeding, the damaged tissue. The silence in the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire, Silas's labored breathing, and the distant roar of the storm was heavy with unspoken dread. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his mind a whirlwind of anatomical knowledge and improvised solutions. Yet despite his skill and desperate efforts, complications arose with alarming speed. Silas's condition, already precarious, began to deteriorate further. A sudden, alarming surge of blood welled up, obscuring Thorne's view, making it nearly impossible to control. His frustration grew, a silent battle waged not just against the injury itself, but against the crushing limitations of his primitive environment. The very air seemed to thicken with the struggle. Each breath Thorne took a testament to his determination. In a moment of intense focus, as Thorne carefully manipulated a stubborn piece of shrapnel that had lodged deep within the wound, a small silver locket, suspended on a thin leather thong, slipped from Silas's neck. It fell silently onto the makeshift operating table, landing with a soft thud against the rough wood. Thorne's gaze, drawn by the unexpected movement, fell upon the object. His breath hitched. It was an antique, intricately engraved, undeniably feminine in its delicate design. With a trembling hand, still slick with blood, he carefully picked it up, his thumb brushing over the cool metal. He unclasped it, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Inside, nestled behind a tiny glass pane, was a miniature portrait. It was Eliza, his Eliza, her familiar, gentle smile, her eyes sparkling with the life he remembered so vividly. The sight struck him with the force of a physical blow, confirming a deeper, more painful connection than he had ever dared to imagine. The image solidified the unspoken history between Silas and his deceased wife, transforming his patient from a mere outlaw into a profound, personal enigma. The blizzard outside raged on, but within Thorne's soul, a new, more tempestuous storm had just begun. Thorne stared at the locket, the miniature portrait of Eliza gazing back at him with an unsettling familiarity. His fingers, still stained with Silas's blood, tightened around the cool silver. A searing wave of jealousy, sharp and unexpected, pierced through his professional detachment. How could she, his Eliza, be immortalized in a locket worn by this outlaw, this man who lay bleeding on his table? Betrayal, sharp and bitter, flooded his senses, mingling with the sorrow that had been his constant companion since her death. For a fleeting, horrifying moment, he questioned his decision, his oath, his very humanity. Why was he fighting so desperately for the life of a man who seemingly held such a secret, intimate connection to the woman he had loved? A connection Thorne himself had never known? A flashback, vivid and painful, assaulted his mind. He saw Eliza, radiant and kind, her hand in his as they walked through a sun-dappled meadow. Her laugh, a gentle melody, echoed in his memory. He remembered her unwavering loyalty, her quiet strength, her devotion to him. This image of Eliza, so pure and true, clashed violently with the locket in his hand, making its presence even more confusing, more agonizing. The thought that she might have harbored secrets, especially secrets involving another man, twisted a knife in his heart. It was an unbearable weight, pressing down on him in the suffocating quiet of the cabin. As Thorne grappled with this emotional maelstrom, Silas stirred on the makeshift operating table. A low moan escaped his lips, followed by a series of fragmented, slurred words, distorted by the laudanum and the lingering shock of his injury. Eliza. Promised. Protect. Silas mumbled, his eyes still closed, his brow furrowed in a drug-induced dream. Never. Let him alone. Thorne froze, his ears straining to decipher the delirious whispers. Silas spoke of protection, of a promise. What promise? What did he mean by never let him alone? The words were disjointed, yet they hinted at a past connection that might not be what Thorne, in his raw jealousy, had immediately assumed. Was Silas Elias's lover? Or was there something else, a different kind of bond? A meaning Thorne was too clouded by his own pain to comprehend. The enigma of Silas deepened, intertwining with the unresolved grief for his wife. Despite the personal turmoil that raged within him, Thorne's professional duty, ingrained through years of rigorous training and the solemn oath he had taken, began to reassert itself. The patient's life still hung by a thread regardless of the emotional earthquake the locket had triggered. He pushed past the searing jealousy, the gnawing questions, the raw sorrow. Silas was bleeding, his life force ebbing away with every beat of his heart. Thorne forced himself to focus, to channel his chaotic emotions into the precision required for the task at hand. His hands, though still trembling with the aftershocks of his discovery, regained their surgical steadiness. He consciously moved his gaze away from the damning locket, placing it carefully on a small, clean cloth by the side of the operating table, out of his immediate line of sight. He returned to the wound, his mind now a disciplined machine, isolating the damaged vessels, meticulously suturing them with the fine thread he had prepared. Each stitch was a small victory against the encroaching darkness, a testament to his renewed resolve. The blizzard outside continued its mournful dirge, but within the cabin, Thorne fought not only for Silas's life but also for his own sanity, his own understanding of a past that now seemed far more complex than he had ever imagined. The true nature of Silas's relationship with Eliza remained a profound mystery, a haunting question mark that fueled Thorne's internal conflict even as it drove him to complete the surgery, to save the man who held the key to a truth he desperately needed to uncover. He had to finish this, not just as a doctor, but as a man seeking answers. Despite Elias Thorne's meticulous efforts and the successful, if agonizingly difficult, completion of the surgery, Silas's condition took a turn for the worse. Hours after the final stitch had been placed and the crude bandages applied, a chilling reality began to manifest itself. Silas's skin, initially pale from blood loss, now felt alarmingly hot to Thorne's touch. A sheen of sweat covered his brow, yet shivers racked his body. His breathing grew shallow and rapid, his pulse thready and erratic. The telltale signs of infection, the very specter that haunted Thorne's nightmares, were undeniable. Despair, cold and insidious, began to creep into Thorne's heart, mirroring the bitter chill that seeped through the cabin walls. His makeshift sterilization methods, the boiling water, the lye soap, the hours of painstaking preparation, seemed to have failed. Had he been too late? Had the frontier conditions simply been too primitive to overcome the grim reaper of sepsis? The memory of the child lost to infection, the very reason he had fled the city, resurfaced with a crushing weight. He paced the small cabin, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the wooden floor, reviewing every step of the operation, every decision, searching for a missed opportunity, a forgotten detail that might have averted this impending disaster. His mind raced, a frantic search through his vast medical knowledge, seeking a solution, any solution, to combat the virulent enemy, now consuming Silas from within. He stopped abruptly by his small, cluttered workbench, his gaze falling upon a collection of dried herbs he kept for various ailments, mostly for the local trappers and homesteaders who occasionally sought his aid for minor complaints. He remembered an old frontier remedy, a powerful herbal poultice for drawing out infection, a remedy passed down through generations of local indigenous tribes. He had always regarded it with a skeptical scientific eye, a quaint superstition rather than a legitimate medical treatment. But now, with Silas's life hanging by the thinnest of threads and all conventional methods seemingly exhausted, this ancient wisdom presented itself as a desperate gamble, a final, audacious throw of the dice. He gathered the dried leaves and roots, their earthy scent filling the cabin, a stark contrast to the sterile smell of the surgical tools. Some of the herbs were old, their potency questionable, but Thorne had nothing else. This was his last resort, a desperate attempt to harness the raw power of nature against the relentless march of disease. He crushed them with a mortar and pestle, grinding them into a fine powder, then mixed them with a small amount of boiled water, creating a thick, pungent paste. The cabin filled with the distinctive aroma of the herbs, a mixture of sage, yarrow, and other less identifiable botanicals. With meticulous care, Thorne applied the warm, viscous poultice directly to Silas's wound, covering it with a clean linen cloth. He worked with a renewed sense of purpose, a silent prayer forming on his lips, a plea to whatever forces governed life and death in this harsh, unforgiving land. The blizzard outside raged unabated, its mournful wail mirroring the storm of anxiety and hope within Thorne's own soul. He watched Silas, his chest rising and falling shallowly, his face flushed with fever, and waited, powerless now, for the poultice to either work its magic or prove his final failure. As he tended to Silas, adjusting the blankets, wiping the sweat from his brow, Thorne noticed something he had overlooked in the frantic rush of surgery. A distinct jagged scar ran along Silas's left forearm, partially hidden by the sleeve of his torn shirt. It was an old scar, faded with time, but unmistakably familiar. Thorne stared at it, a jolt of recognition shooting through him. He reached out, his finger tracing the uneven line. He knew that scar. He had inflicted it himself, during a forgotten boyhood skirmish years ago. A clumsy accident with a sharp stick while playing in a creek. The memory, long buried beneath layers of trauma and isolation, surfaced with startling clarity. Silas, the notorious outlaw, Elias's mysterious confidant, was also the boy from his distant past, a forgotten playmate from a life Thorne had tried so desperately to leave behind. The revelation added another layer of complexity to the intertwined fates before him, hinting at a shared history far deeper and more personal than he could have ever imagined. Hours stretched into eternity, marked only by the rhythmic creaking of the cabin and the relentless howl of the wind. Thorne sat vigil by Silas's bedside, his eyes fixed on the outlaw's feverish face, searching for any sign of change. The heady aroma of the herbal poultice mingled with the metallic tang of dried blood and the acrid scent of wood smoke, creating a potent, almost mystical atmosphere within the small dwelling. He had done all he could. Now, the fate of Silas, and perhaps a piece of Thorne's own fractured soul, rested in the balance. The memory of the child lost to infection gnawed at him, a cold, persistent whisper of past failure. Would this desperate gamble, this unorthodox frontier medicine, truly make a difference? Or was he merely delaying the inevitable, prolonging a life destined to be extinguished, much like the flickering flame of the oil lamp beside him? Then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, a shift occurred. The frantic fluttering of Silas's eyelids lessened. The shallow, ragged breaths began to deepen, becoming more regular. Thorne leaned closer, his heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and burgeoning hope. He reached out, his hand hovering over Silas's forehead, then gently pressed against it. The burning heat that had persisted for hours was receding, replaced by a warmth that felt almost normal. A wave of profound relief washed over Thorne, so powerful it threatened to buckle his knees. The poultice, combined with his surgical skill, his meticulous if improvised efforts, had worked. The tide had turned. The grim reaper had been momentarily repelled, but lingering questions like stubborn shadows clung to the corners of his mind. A few more hours passed, and with the first faint blush of dawn painting the snow-laden peaks outside, Silas's eyes fluttered open. They were cloudy at first, unfocused, then slowly, painfully, they sharpened. He blinked, his gaze sweeping the unfamiliar cabin before settling on Thorne. A flicker of recognition, then surprise crossed his features. His gaze dropped to his bandaged abdomen, then to the small clean cloth where Thorne had placed the locket. A weak smile, tinged with pain, touched his lips. "Elias," Silas rasped, his voice hoarse and thin, "you saved me." He paused, gathering strength, his eyes never leaving Thorne's. "And Eliza's locket. You found it." Thorne nodded, unable to speak, a knot forming in his throat. He waited, his own heart hammering for the explanation that had haunted him for days. Silas took a slow, deliberate breath. Eliza. She was more than just a friend, Elias. She was like a sister to me. After her family, after the tragedy, when she was just a girl, I swore I'd always look out for her. A promise. He coughed, a dry, painful sound. That locket. It was a gift from her years ago. She had me promise to never let it leave my sight. She knew my life was dangerous. She wanted to make sure if anything ever happened to me, someone would find it and know who I was. He paused again, his gaze meeting Thorne's directly. She found me a few weeks before she passed. She was worried about you, Elias. Knew you'd blame yourself. Knew you'd run. She asked me to find you, to deliver a message from her family, a message of love, of forgiveness, and to tell you to live, truly live, for both of you. Silas's voice was barely a whisper now, strained with effort, but his words resonated with an undeniable truth. The betrayal Thorne had perceived was a misunderstanding, born of his own grief, his isolation, and his inability to see past his pain. Eliza's enduring love for him and her concern for his well-being had reached out even from beyond the grave, carried by the very man Thorne had judged so harshly. Outside, the last vestiges of the blizzard began to subside, the wind's mournful wail softening to a gentle sigh. But the emotional storm within Thorne was far from over. He stared at Silas, the man who was both his patient and a ghost from his past, now revealing himself as an unlikely messenger of love and forgiveness. Thorne's own guilt and misjudgment, his deeply entrenched assumptions, now lay exposed, raw and vulnerable in the dawning light. He had saved Silas's life, but in doing so, Silas had, in a profound and unexpected way, begun to save him. The blizzard finally surrendered, its fury spent, leaving behind a world transformed. A pristine blanket of white now covered every peak and valley, sparkling under the nascent rays of the sun, reflecting a serene silence that permeated the air. Inside the cabin, Silas, though still weak, was recovering steadily. The fever had completely broken, and the faint color returning to his cheeks offered a stark contrast to his earlier pallor. Elias Thorne watched him, a profound sense of relief washing over him, a feeling so potent it almost brought him to his knees. Yet this relief was inextricably intertwined with a deep, aching regret for his past assumptions. For the years he had spent cloaked in bitterness and misunderstanding, Thorne approached Silas's makeshift bed, his movements slow and deliberate. The weight of his own misjudgment pressed heavily upon him. He cleared his throat, the sound unusually loud in the quiet cabin. "Silas," he began, his voice raspy with emotion, "I owe you an apology. For my assumptions, for my prejudice. I let my grief and my own pain blind me to the truth." He looked away, unable to meet Silas's gaze directly, shame burning in his chest. I believed the worst. I was wrong." Silas, with a surprising strength, reached out a hand, his fingers brushing Thorne's arm. "No need for apologies, Elias," he rasped, a faint smile playing on his lips. "We all carry our burdens. You saved my life. That's all that matters." His eyes, though still a little hazy, held a deep, unwavering gratitude. "You are a remarkable man, Doctor. To save someone you believed was your rival, with nothing but your wits and a few kitchen tools, that's humanity, pure and simple." Their eyes met, and in that shared glance, an unlikely bond forged in the crucible of desperation and revelation began to solidify. The old animosities, the simmering resentments, seemed to dissipate like mist in the morning sun, replaced by a quiet understanding. The successful, albeit unconventional surgery, coupled with Silas's revelations about Eliza, had brought Thorne a profound sense of peace, a tranquility he hadn't known since before that fateful day he lost the child. He had faced his past trauma head-on, not by fleeing it, but by confronting it in the most unexpected way. He had emerged victorious, not just as a surgeon who had defied impossible odds, but as a man who had wrestled with his inner demons and found a path towards healing. The crushing weight of guilt that had burdened him for so long, the self-imposed exile, the reclusiveness that had defined his existence, all began to lift. He felt lighter, as if the very air in his lungs was cleaner, fresher. As the days turned into weeks, Silas slowly regained his strength. He spoke of his past, of the life he had led, not with pride, but with a weary resignation. He had been an outlaw, yes, but not without a code, not without a conscience. He admitted to a life of hard choices, of survival in a harsh world. But now, something within him had shifted. "You showed me something, Elias," Silas said one afternoon, looking out at the vast, serene landscape. "You showed me that a man can choose to heal, not just wounds, but souls. I want to change. I want to try to make amends." Thorne, no longer haunted by the specter of his past failures, looked towards the future with a renewed sense of purpose. The frontier, once a refuge from his pain, now felt like a canvas for new beginnings. He realized his skill, his knowledge, was too valuable to be hoarded in isolation. The need for true medical care, even unconventional care, was immense in this untamed land. He would continue his healing work, not as a penance, but as a calling. He would embrace the challenges, the solitude, but no longer let them define him. He would carry Eliza's memory, not as a source of sorrow, but as a testament to enduring love and forgiveness. The doctor from the city, once broken and lost, had found his redemption in the heart of the wilderness, becoming not just the frontier surgeon, but a beacon of hope in a world that desperately needed it. The blizzard had passed, and in its wake, a new dawn had truly broken for Elias Thorne.